Welcome. Today, Israel is marking 1 year since the October 7th Hamas attacks, when men breached the Gaza frontier and targeted Israeli border communities. Over 1,200 people were killed, including those brought to Gaza as hostages. The attacks have triggered a wave of violence across the region, still being played out today. The Israeli bombardments and ground war in Gaza have claimed over 41,000 lives. And a year on, the war in Lebanon is escalating too. Well, we start our coverage this hour with a look at the commemorations taking place in Israel today, including at the site of the Nova Festival.
Techno blares out on loudspeakers exactly 1 year after the Hamas attacks began. The beats are the same which played during the Nova Music Festival, where nearly 400 revelers were gunned down and others were taken hostage. Israel's president was at Monday's tribute as families looked to each other for comfort.
We were last week, we were in the grave, but this is the ceremony. This is where she was. This is where she was happy in the last her moments. It was here.
We lost our son here. He was at the party. It seems to be like yesterday was the last day we saw him. For us, yesterday was the last day of the old life.
Monday's commemoration included a minute of silence as well as tributes and prayers. The Israeli flag was lowered as attendees looked on visibly scarred. The Nova Music Festival took place just 5 kilometers east of the Gaza Strip. And for some gathered here, the remembrance event at the same location gave them both anxiety and a sense of closure.
I come from there, and this is area, it's the first time that I see. And in my imagination, I see all the guys run in the field, and I said, it's impossible. Okay? It's not real. And now, it's really afraid to come here, but I say to myself that if I were not to come, the Hamas will win.
As Israel paused to remember the deadliest day in its history, news broke of the death of an Israeli hostage. 28-year-old Idan Shtivi was believed to be alive, but now a group representing families of hostages announced he was killed during last year's attack and his body taken by Hamas to Gaza.
And as we were just hearing there, a year on from October 7th, dozens of hostages are still being held in Gaza. Hundreds more were taken and have since been killed in the enclave. Emerald Maxwell now looks at the families' fight for recognition and justice.
As the 1 year mark approached since their family members were taken hostage, they protested outside the Israeli Prime Minister's house, calling for an end to the war and a deal to bring their loved ones home.
We won't stop reminding this bad government that saving life is more important than the war.
As the government expands the war to a new front, they reminded the world that dozens of people were still in Hamas captivity since they were taken on October 7th, 2023. Around 240 hostages, 214 of them alive. Men, women, children, and even babies. Hamas's bargaining chip and a human shield against Israel. After 14 days in captivity, Judith Tyranan and her daughter Natalie Shoshana were the first hostages to be released by Hamas, officially for humanitarian reasons. 4 days later, 2 other captives were released for the same reason. On the 27th of October, Israel began its ground offensive on Gaza. 2 days later, the Israeli army rescued its first hostage, 19-year-old soldier Ori Megidish, acting on specific intelligence of her whereabouts. Demonstrations in Israel began in mid-November, demanding the hostages' return. Meanwhile, the Israeli army recovered the lifeless bodies of 2 of them from Gaza. Later that month, a march set off from Jaffa to Jerusalem, calling for action from the Israeli government.
7 of my family members are kidnapped in Gaza. We need them back now at any price.
At the end of November, during the first and only truce of the war so far, 105 hostages were freed. The year ended with a blunder. The Israeli army admitted having mistakenly killed 3 hostages who were waving for help, provoking public anger. Between February and June 2024, 6 captives were freed in Rafah and Nusayra. In March, the United Nations claimed to have received convincing information about sexual violence committed against several hostages. On August 27th, the Israeli army announced having rescued Qaid Farhan al-Qadi from Gaza, a Bedouin from the Negev. Days later, the bodies of 6 hostages were found.
My sweet boy, finally you're free!
In the aftermath, hundreds of thousands of people marched against the government. According to official Israeli figures, 63 hostages are still presumed alive in Gaza to date, but that is probably an overestimate. According to Israeli media, Benjamin Netanyahu told a closed parliamentary committee on September 22nd that he believes the likely number is about 50.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, commemorations are taking place throughout Israel today. And a bit earlier on, the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, as well as the Mayor of Jerusalem, visited a memorial honouring the 87 Jerusalemites who've been killed in this past year. Here's a little of what the Prime Minister had to say.
On this day, in this place, and in many places in our country, we remember our fallen, our hostages that we are obliged to return, and our heroes who fell for the defense of the homeland and the land. We went through a terrible massacre a year ago, and we stood up as a people, as lions, a people that rise like a lioness.
Well, I'm very pleased to welcome now live to the programme José Brunner. He's an Emeritus Professor at Tel Aviv University, where his research focuses in part on memory, identity and trauma. Welcome to the programme and thank you for joining us today.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Look, Israel is in mourning today. How would you sum up the public mood then, a year on from the deadliest attacks in the history of Israel?
I think Israel has been in a melancholia for quite some months now. It's a very sad and somber mood because it has become very clear that this war is being fought by a government that has no plan at all. They are hitting Gaza, they are hitting the south of Lebanon after being attacked from both sides. It's a defensive war, but it has escalated into a rampage of revenge. And it's not leading anywhere. It's not getting the hostages back, and it's not getting us any closer to any solution of the conflict we're living in. And I think more and more people understand this, and it's making everybody sad. I think the country is divided into 2 groups. The group that wants the hostages back, and their voices become more and more sad and desperate because they realize the government is not paying any attention to them. And the other group that wants a victory and doesn't care that much about the hostages. But both groups must realize that it's not getting anywhere.
We mentioned earlier on in the programme that there's controversy around the official government memorial that's taking place later on today. Most of the families of victims are boycotting the event. It's being pre-recorded, in fact, without a live audience because there are fears that there might be heckling of the politicians there. We have counter-ceremonies, private ceremonies taking place today. I wonder what you make of those ceremonies and what it tells us about where Israel is now.
I think it tells us about the disconnect between the civil society of Israel, the villages, kibbutzim, the small towns around the Gaza Strip on the Israeli side, where people have lost their loved ones, and the government that is big in announcements like you just showed what Netanyahu said in Jerusalem. They like memorials, they like symbolism, but they're not doing anything for the hostages, because doing anything for the hostages would mean to negotiate. It would mean to move towards a compromise. And that's something the present Israeli government is not capable of doing. And so this disconnect has also led to the disconnect between the official ceremony and the local ceremonies held, grassroots ceremonies held in the various places where Hamas attacked. These are two different events, and I think the government ceremony is going to be, a big pompous event that has no resonance.
I mentioned at the top that one of your expertise is trauma, and I wonder how you think Israeli society is living with that. I mean, as you said, you see it as divided sort of in two camps now, but is that trauma impacted in daily life now? Do we see its ramifications in politics? And yes, how would you assess this moment on a sort of psychological level as well, given that there are hostages who remain in Gaza? There are some people who say, look, actually October 7th happened a year ago, but this war is still going on.
It's not only that the war is going on. You're right about the trauma, and one of its effects, I think, is that time has not moved on in Israel. It's not only that the war is going on, the 7th of October is still going on. We are a year after 7th of October 2023, but we are still in that day in Israel. Israel has not been able to, if you watch the Israeli news, you see an interview or a film on something that has to do with the 7th of October last year every single day on every Israeli television station. Israel is not moving on. Israel is staying in the victim identity of the 7th of October. It is not realizing really what it is doing around Israel in Gaza and in the south of Lebanon, because it's still in its own suffering and hasn't been able to move on to mourning or to process anything that has happened in any particular way, because we are in this war, because nothing is moving on at all.
And I do want to talk to you very much about Gaza and about Lebanon. We'll come on to that in a moment. But just to stay with Israel for one more question, I want to quote you the Israeli historian Tom Segev, who said, the thing we lost on October 7th last year and we haven't gotten back is our feeling of security. You talked about the failings of the government and how that's impacted Israel today. What about the failures of the intelligence services? How has that impacted Israelis' sense of fear, and can that be regained now?
I think that's what the government and the army has tried to do with these spectacular acts they did with the Hezbollah, with the beepers exploding and the walkie-talkies exploding and the targeted killings, including of Nasrallah. I think this is a big campaign that has been launched not only for military purposes, but also to instill some kind of trust again in the Israeli society that the security services know what they have been doing, because they clearly did not know what they have been doing before the 7th of October. So I think now it's as much a public campaign for Israeli trust as it is a military campaign against the Hezbollah, to have all these big spectacular events to show we know where these guys are, we know how to explode them, and so on and so forth. You can trust us again. We have recovered our bearings, and we know how to conduct the war. But it's not true. They have recovered their bearings in terms of intelligence services, in terms of secret operations. They're very good at that. But they haven't recovered their bearings in terms of a strategic plan how to live in the Middle East as a Jewish state. There is no plan for this.
All right, well, let's talk finally then about Gaza. In the last year, Israel has subjected Palestinians there to very intense airstrikes. At least 41,000 people have been killed. Gaza is unlivable now. I'd like to try and understand from you whether you think, I mean, you touched on this already, but whether Israelis do recognize the scale of the suffering that is being inflicted now by Israel on Gaza. I mean, we know, for example, that often images from Gaza aren't seen on Israeli television. Are Palestinians dehumanized in the Israeli public narrative? How would you characterize it?
When you watch Israeli TV, you see something that is like a computer game. You have these shooter games where your own perspective is of the shooter. It's like these GoPro cameras. You see them. You see what Israeli soldiers see. You don't see much of civilian life in Gaza on Israeli TV. You do see the destruction, but it's the destruction of a ghost town. You don't really see people in Gaza living in these ruins, and that these are their living conditions. I would like to say two things here. One is that Israel is launching, a terrible destructive war, a terrible bombing campaign, artillery. It's really destroying the entire infrastructure of Gaza, no question about it. But it's also clear that the Hamas ruined the whole infrastructure of Gaza by having all these tunnels underneath living quarters, hospitals, mosques, schools, and so on. So I think the civilians of Gaza have been badly treated by the Hamas first and are now being destroyed by Israel. So they're really suffering and they're being dehumanized because they're being used as human shields by Hamas, and they're being killed at enormous figures by Israel.
Just one final question for you on that then. How do Israelis live with that? Is there a sense of understanding of what it is that their government, their army is doing in Gaza, and indeed now in Lebanon?
I don't think so. In fact, all these demonstrations that we now have in Israel that call for a ceasefire, and there are demonstrations that call for a ceasefire, they are oriented towards getting the hostages back. They speak about a ceasefire in order to get the hostages back, not in order not to kill Gazans anymore. The life of Gazans in Israel is not worth anything. So nobody's demonstrating against the war because of the war crimes Israel is committing. People are demonstrating for a ceasefire because they want to negotiate with the hostages. So in that sense, there is no empathy for the Palestinians in Gaza on the Israeli side at all.
José Brunner talking to us there. Thank you so much for your time, sir. I appreciate it.
Thank you.